The autumn wind carried the scent of desperation through the dusty streets of Millbrook, and Catherine Moore could taste it on her lips as she stood on the courthouse steps, her hands bound behind her back with rough hemp rope. The crowd below her buzzed with an energy that made her stomach churn, their faces upturned like hungry birds waiting for carrion. She had never imagined this moment would come, yet here she was, 26 years old and being offered to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock. The auctioneer, Timothy Rogers, cleared his throat and raised his gavel. His voice boomed across the town square, cutting through the murmur of voices and the restless shifting of boots on packed earth. Ladies and gentlemen, we come now to the final item of today's proceedings. Miss Catherine Moore, age 26, unmarried, and by town ordinance deemed a burden upon our community resources. Catherine's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her chin lifted. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble, though inside her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The faces in the crowd blurred together, some familiar, some strange, all wearing expressions that ranged from curious to cruel. She recognized the blacksmith's wife, Barbara Martinez, whispering behind her gloved hand to Janet Brown, the baker's daughter. Their eyes held a mixture of pity and relief that it was not them standing here in her place. The town of Millbrook had fallen on hard times. The railroad had passed them by, taking with it the promise of prosperity and growth. Crops had failed for 2 seasons running, and the winter stores were dangerously low. The town council, led by Mayor Douglas Diaz, had implemented what they called efficiency measures to reduce the burden on community resources. Unmarried women over 25 with no family to support them were considered non-contributing members of society, and the law now required they be auctioned off to anyone willing to take responsibility for their care and feeding. Catherine had no family left. Her parents had died of fever 3 years ago, and her younger brother had headed west in search of gold, leaving her alone with nothing but the small cabin on the edge of town and her skill with a needle. She had managed to scrape by taking in sewing and mending, but when the town's prosperity dried up, so did her customers' ability to pay. The cabin had been seized for unpaid taxes just 2 weeks ago, and she had been living on the charity of the church ever since. "The bidding will start at $5, Timothy Rogers announced, his voice carrying across the square. "Miss Moore is healthy, capable of household duties, and skilled in needlework. She comes with no debts or encumbrances." Catherine closed her eyes briefly, trying to block out the humiliation of being described like merchandise. When she opened them again, she caught sight of a man standing apart from the crowd, leaning against a weathered post near the general store. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of long days spent outdoors. She had never seen him before, which was unusual in a town as small as Millbrook. His eyes met hers across the square, and something in his steady gaze made her breath catch. Unlike the others, there was no hunger or calculation in his expression, only a quiet intensity that she could not read. $5, called out Frank Patel, who owned the saloon and had a reputation for working his girls hard. Catherine's stomach twisted at the thought of what he might expect from her. $7. This from Eric Evans, a farmer whose wife had died the previous spring, leaving him with 4 young children and a temper that grew shorter with each passing day. The bidding continued, voices calling out numbers like they were haggling over the price of grain or cattle. Catherine tried to detach herself from the proceedings, to imagine she was somewhere else, anywhere else. She thought of her mother's garden, where she had spent countless hours as a child, learning the names of flowers and the secrets of making things grow. She thought of the stories her father used to tell by the fireplace on winter evenings, tales of brave knights and clever princesses who always found a way to save themselves. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. $15. Eric Evans's voice cut through her reverie, harsh and demanding. The crowd murmured its approval at the substantial sum. $15 was more than many men in Millbrook earned in a month. Catherine's heart sank. She knew Eric Evans, knew the way his first wife had grown thin and nervous in the years before her death. She had seen the bruises that Heather Alvarez, his late wife, had tried to hide beneath long sleeves and high collars. The thought of living in that house, of caring for his children while enduring whatever treatment he deemed appropriate, made her feel sick. $20. The voice was quiet but carried clearly across the square. Catherine's head snapped up, searching for the speaker. It was the stranger, the man who had been watching from beside the general store. He had stepped forward slightly, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unchanged. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. $20 was an enormous sum, more than anyone had expected to hear today. Eric Evans's face darkened, and he shot a venomous look at the stranger. 25! Evans shouted, his voice tight with anger. The stranger regarded him calmly for a moment before responding. 30. Who is that man? Someone whispered loudly enough for Catherine to hear. Never seen him before, came the response. Must be passing through. 35! Evans was practically snarling now, his face red with fury at being outbid by an outsider. 50! The word fell into the square like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shocked silence. $50 was more money than most people in Millbrook had ever seen at one time. Catherine stared at the stranger, trying to understand what game he was playing. No one spent $50 on a woman they had never met, especially not a woman who came with no dowry, no connections, no promise of anything beyond the clothes on her back. Checkpoint they won. Eric Evans opened his mouth as if to bid again, then closed it. His face had gone from red to pale, and Catherine could see the calculations running behind his eyes. $50 would buy seed for next year's planting, or livestock, or any number of things more valuable than a woman to keep house and warm his bed. He stepped back into the crowd, his expression murderous but his silence speaking louder than words. Timothy Rogers looked around the square, his gavel raised. $50 going once, going twice. He paused, giving anyone else a chance to speak up, but the crowd remained silent, stunned by the unprecedented sum. Sold to the gentleman in the brown coat. The stranger stepped forward, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a leather pouch. He counted out the money with calm precision, placing the bills in Timothy Rogers's outstretched hand. The auctioneer examined each note carefully before nodding his approval. What name shall I put on the papers? Rogers asked, pulling out a ledger and a pen. Ryan Long, the stranger replied. His voice was deep and steady, with an accent that Catherine could not place. It was not the flat vowels of the local farmers or the clipped tones of the few educated men in town. There was something else there, something that spoke of distant places and different ways of life. As the crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded. Ryan Long approached the courthouse steps. Catherine watched him come, her mind racing with questions and fears. What did he want with her? What did he expect in return for his $50? The sum was so large that it suggested either great wealth or great desperation, and she was not sure which possibility frightened her more. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were dark brown, almost black, and that his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his time outdoors. There was a scar along his left temple, thin and white with age, and his hands were calloused from hard work. Miss Moore, he said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. My name is Ryan Long. I have a ranch about 2 days' ride north of here. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you employment as my housekeeper. The pay is room, board, and $5 a month, with Sundays off and the understanding that you're free to leave whenever you choose. Catherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. Employment? Yes, ma'am. I need someone to keep house and cook meals. The work is honest, and I give you my word that you'll be treated with respect. The deputy sheriff, a thin man named Douglas Diaz, who also served as the mayor, cleared his throat impatiently. The papers need to be signed, he said, thrusting a document at Ryan. Makes it all legal and proper. Ryan took the papers but did not look at them. Instead, he kept his eyes on Catherine's face. The choice is yours, he said quietly. You can come with me, or I can tear up these papers right now and walk away. But if you stay, you'll be back here next week when they auction off the church pews to raise more money. Catherine felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She looked out at the town square, at the familiar buildings and faces that had been her whole world for 26 years. Millbrook was dying. That much was clear. The people who remained were growing desperate, willing to sacrifice anyone they deemed expendable to preserve what little they had left. She thought of Eric Evans's angry face, of Frank Patel's calculating eyes, of the whispers and stares that would follow her wherever she went if she stayed. Then she looked back at Ryan Long, this stranger who had paid $50 for the privilege of offering her a job rather than demanding her submission. There was something in his manner that reminded her of her father, a quiet strength that did not need to prove itself through bluster or cruelty. It was a gamble trusting him, but staying in Millbrook was no longer an option. "I'll come with you," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Ryan nodded once, then turned to Douglas Diaz. "Cut her loose." "Now see here," Diaz protested. "The papers need to be signed first. There are procedures to follow." "Cut her loose," Ryan repeated, and though his voice remained calm, there was something in it that made the deputy sheriff take a step backward. Diaz fumbled with his keys, unlocking the iron shackles around Catherine's wrists. The metal had chafed her skin raw, and she rubbed at the marks as feeling returned to her hands. Ryan signed the papers with quick, efficient strokes, then folded them and tucked them into his jacket pocket. "Do you have belongings to collect?" he asked Catherine. She shook her head. Everything she had owned had been sold to pay her debts or seized by the town. The dress she wore, a simple brown wool that had seen better days, was borrowed from the church charity box. She had nothing left of her old life except the memories. "Then we'll stop at the general store for supplies," Ryan said. "You'll need proper clothes for ranch work, and we'll want to get on the road before dark." They walked across the square together, Catherine acutely aware of the stares that followed them. She heard the whispers starting up again, speculation about who this stranger was and what he really wanted with her. Let them talk, she thought. In a few hours she would be gone from this place forever, and their opinions would matter as little as the wind. The general store was dim and cluttered, smelling of leather and tobacco, and the sharp scent of pickled goods. Donna Torres, the shopkeeper's wife, looked up from her ledger with curious eyes as they entered. She was a small, nervous woman who had always treated Catherine with the distant politeness reserved for those of questionable social standing. "Miss Moore," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I heard about the auction. Congratulations, I suppose." Catherine felt her cheeks burn again, but Ryan stepped forward before she could respond. "We need traveling clothes for the lady," he said. "Something practical for ranch work. Also boots, a hat, and a warm coat." Donna Torres's eyebrows rose at the request. Most men who bought women at auction were more concerned with how they looked than how warmly they were dressed. "Of course," she said, leading them to a corner where women's clothing hung on wooden pegs. "We have several dresses that might suit." As Catherine examined the available options, she became aware that Ryan had moved to the other side of the store, giving her privacy to make her selections. It was a small courtesy, but one that spoke to his character. Eric Evans would have stood over her, dictating her choices and complaining about the cost. Frank Patel would have chosen the most revealing garments available, caring nothing for her comfort or modesty. She selected a sturdy blue dress made of wool and cotton, practical boots that would protect her feet, and a heavy coat lined with sheep's wool. The clothes were simple but well made, and more expensive than anything she had owned in years. When she brought them to the counter, Ryan paid without question or complaint, adding a wide-brimmed hat and leather gloves to the pile. "You'll want these too," Donna Torres said, producing a set of warm undergarments and woolen stockings. "Gets cold up north, especially at night." Again Ryan paid without comment, though Catherine noticed him wince slightly at the mounting total. $50 had been a fortune by Millbrook standards, but outfitting a person for ranch life was expensive, and she wondered if he had enough money left for supplies for himself. Checkpoint 2. As if reading her thoughts, he moved to the other side of the store and began selecting items for their journey: coffee, flour, salt pork, dried beans, and other staples that would keep well on the trail. He also bought ammunition for the rifle that Catherine now noticed he carried, as well as grain for his horse and a second bedroll. "Planning to camp out?" Donna Torres asked, tallying up the purchases. "It's a 2-day ride," Ryan replied. "We'll need to stop for the night." Something in his tone discouraged further questions, and Donna Torres completed the transaction in silence. The total came to nearly $70, Catherine realized with growing alarm. Ryan had spent more on her in one afternoon than she had seen in the past year. They loaded their supplies into saddlebags and tied the larger items to the back of Ryan's horse, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. Catherine changed into her new clothes in the small room behind the store, marveling at the feel of clean, well-fitted garments against her skin. The dress was practical but flattering, and the boots fit perfectly. For the first time in months, she felt like a person rather than a burden. When she emerged, Ryan was waiting by his horse, his expression unreadable. "Ready?" he asked. Catherine looked back at the town square one last time. A few people were still lingering, watching their preparations with undisguised curiosity. She saw Barbara Martinez whispering to Janet Brown, saw Eric Evans glowering from the doorway of the saloon. These people had been her neighbors, her community, but they had been willing to sell her to the highest bidder without a second thought. Whatever lay ahead with Ryan Long could hardly be worse than what she was leaving behind. "Ready," she said. Ryan helped her mount the horse, his touch careful and respectful. She settled herself behind him, acutely aware of his warmth and the solid strength of his back. The horse moved forward at his gentle urging, and they rode out of Millbrook as the afternoon sun slanted low through the autumn trees. They traveled in silence for the first hour, following a dirt road that wound through fields of stubbled corn and abandoned homesteads. Catherine had never been more than a few miles from town, and she found herself fascinated by the changing landscape. The farther they got from Millbrook, the more the countryside seemed to come alive. She saw deer grazing in distant meadows, hawks circling overhead, and wildflowers blooming along the roadside despite the lateness of the season. "You've never been away from town before," Ryan said, and Catherine realized he had been watching her reactions. "No," she admitted. "My parents always said there was no need to travel when everything we needed was right there." "And now?" Catherine considered the question. "Now I think maybe they were wrong. About a lot of things." Ryan was quiet for a long moment. "Change is hard," he said finally, "but sometimes it's necessary. Is that why you came to Millbrook? For change?" She felt him tense slightly, and she wondered if she had overstepped. They were still strangers after all, bound together by nothing more than a business transaction and a shared need to escape. "Something like that," he said, and his tone suggested the subject was closed. They rode on through the afternoon, stopping occasionally to rest the horse and stretch their legs. Catherine found herself studying her companion whenever she thought he was not looking. There was something about him that did not quite fit with his story. His clothes were well made but worn, his equipment expensive but carefully maintained. He carried himself like a man accustomed to command. Yet he had spoken to her with a deference that suggested he was used to treating women as equals rather than property. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Ryan turned off the main road onto a smaller track that led through a dense grove of oak trees. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, dismounting and helping Catherine down from the horse. "There's a stream just through those trees, and the grove will give us shelter from the wind." Catherine looked around nervously. She had never spent a night outdoors in her life, and the thought of sleeping on the ground with only a stranger for protection made her stomach clench with anxiety. Ryan seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll set up your bedroll on the far side of the fire," he said, beginning to unload their supplies. "You'll have privacy, and I give you my word that you'll be safe." "Thank you," Catherine said, though her voice came out smaller than she had intended. They worked together to make camp, Ryan handling the heavier tasks while Catherine gathered kindling and arranged their supplies. He proved to be efficient and competent, setting up a comfortable campsite with the ease of long practice. Soon a small fire was crackling between them, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees and filling the air with the comforting scent of wood smoke. Ryan prepared their evening meal with the same quiet competence he had shown in everything else. Salt pork fried in a small iron skillet, beans heated over the fire, coffee brewed strong and black. It was simple food, but after days of subsisting on charity and scraps, Catherine found it delicious. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they ate, partly from curiosity and partly to fill the silence that stretched between them. Ryan was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer. Finally, he set down his tin cup and looked across the fire at her. "It's not much yet," he said. "A few hundred acres in a valley about 30 miles north of here. Good water, Decent grazing, but it needs work. The house is small but sound, and there's a barn and a few outbuildings. How long have you had it? About 6 months. I bought it from a man who was heading back east after his wife died. He was eager to sell, so I got it for a fair price. Catherine sensed there was more to the story, but she did not press. Instead, she asked, "What kind of work needs to be done?" "Fencing, mostly. The previous owner let things slide toward the end. There are maybe 50 head of cattle on the property, but they're scattered to hell and gone. I need to round them up and get them properly contained before winter sets in hard." "That sounds like a lot of work for one person." Ryan's smile was rueful. "It is. That's part of why I need help with the house. I've been living on beans and hardtack for months because I don't have time to cook proper meals." Catherine found herself smiling in return. "Well, I can certainly do better than beans and hardtack. I'm counting on it." As the fire burned lower, Ryan excused himself to check on the horse and secure their camp for the night. Catherine took the opportunity to walk to the stream he had mentioned, following the sound of running water through the trees. The stream was small but clear, fed by springs somewhere up in the hills. She knelt beside it and splashed the cold water on her face, washing away the dust of travel and the lingering shame of the day's events. When she returned to the camp, Ryan had laid out her bedroll on the far side of the fire, as promised. He was sitting on a fallen log, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. The sight should have been alarming, but instead Catherine found it oddly comforting. Whatever his reasons for helping her, he was clearly a man who took responsibility seriously. "Get some rest," he said without looking up from his work. "We'll want to start early tomorrow. It's a long ride to the ranch." Catherine settled into her bedroll, grateful for its warmth and softness. Above her, the stars were beginning to appear, more brilliant than she had ever seen them in town. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them, rustling leaves and distant animal calls, but she felt safer than she had in weeks. "Ryan," she said quietly. "Yes? Why did you really come to the auction today?" Checkpoint 3. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. Catherine began to think he would not answer, but finally his voice came out of the darkness, quiet and thoughtful. "I heard about what was happening in Millbrook," he said, "about the auctions and the desperation. I thought maybe I could help." "Help how?" "By offering someone a choice. A real choice, not just a selection of bad options." Catherine turned on her side to look at him across the dying fire. His face was shadowed, but she could see the serious set of his features. "That's a dangerous thing to do for a stranger." "Maybe, but I've been in situations where I didn't have choices. I know what that feels like." There was something in his voice, a weight of experience that spoke of hardships she could not imagine. Catherine wanted to ask more, to understand what had brought him to that auction today with $50 and a willingness to risk it on a woman he had never met. But exhaustion was pulling at her, and the warmth of the bedroll was making her eyelids heavy. "Thank you," she said simply. "Get some sleep, Catherine. Tomorrow we start over." She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of him banking the fire and settling into his own bedroll. Despite her fears about sleeping outdoors with a stranger, she felt herself drifting toward sleep. For the first time in months, she was not wondering where her next meal would come from or whether she would have a roof over her head. Whatever tomorrow brought, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. But as sleep began to claim her, she heard something that made her eyes snap open. Hoofbeats, distant but approaching, and the low murmur of voices carried on the night wind. Ryan had heard it too. She could see him sitting up in his bedroll, his rifle already in his hands. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't move unless I tell you to." Catherine's heart began to pound as the hoofbeats grew closer. Through the trees, she could see the flicker of torchlight, and now she could make out individual voices. One of them sounded familiar, and with a chill of recognition, she realized it was Eric Evans. "They came this way," Evans was saying, his voice thick with anger. "I saw the tracks at the crossroads." "You sure about this, Eric?" another voice asked. Catherine thought it might be Frank Patel. "That man paid fair and square. The law says she belongs to him now." "The law?" Evans spat. What's the law matter when some drifter comes into our town and steals what should have been mine? I had the high bid before he showed up. $50 is a lot of money to throw away on revenge, a third voice pointed out. It's not about the money, Evans replied. It's about respect, about not letting outsiders come in and take what belongs to us. The voices were getting closer, and Catherine could see the orange glow of torches through the trees. She estimated there were at least 4 men, possibly more. Ryan had moved to a position behind a large oak tree, his rifle trained on the approaching riders. In the dim starlight, his face was grim and focused. "Catherine," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it. "There's a hollow log about 20 feet behind you. If shooting starts, get behind it and stay down." She nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. The hoofbeats were very close now, and she could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. The men had slowed their horses, probably trying to locate the camp by the dying embers of the fire. "There," Evan's voice came clearly through the night air. "I can see smoke. They're camped in that grove." "Easy, Eric," Frank Patel said. "Let's just talk to them first. Maybe we can work something out." "I'm done talking," Evans replied, and Catherine heard the metallic click of a gun being cocked. Ryan rose from his position behind the tree, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the small clearing. "State your business." The approaching riders stopped, their torches casting wild shadows among the trees. Catherine could see them now, 4 men on horseback, their faces hard and determined in the flickering light. Evans sat his horse in the lead, a shotgun across his saddle. Behind him were Frank Patel, Douglas Diaz, and a 4th man she did not recognize. "We've come for the woman," Evans called back. "That auction was rigged, and everyone knows it. You had no right to bid against honest folk." "I had every right," Ryan replied calmly. "I paid the asking price, and the sale was legal. Now turn around and go home before this gets out of hand." "Out of hand?" Evans laughed harshly. "Mister, you don't know what out of hand looks like, but you're about to learn." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring between the 2 groups of men, the torchlight casting dancing shadows that made everyone look like demons. Catherine pressed herself lower against the fallen log Ryan had indicated, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. The night air had grown cold, and she could see her breath misting in the starlight. "You're making a mistake, Evans," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the 4 guns trained on him. "This woman is under my protection now, and I won't let you take her." Eric Evans spurred his horse forward a few steps, his shotgun now openly aimed at Ryan's chest. "Your protection?" He laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the quiet grove. "You think $50 makes you some kind of hero? You don't know what you bought yourself, stranger. That woman's got a reputation in this town." Catherine felt heat flood her cheeks at the implication. She knew what Evans was suggesting, the whispers that had followed her since her parents' death. A woman alone, taking in sewing from unmarried men, accepting charity from the church. In a town like Millbrook, such things bred gossip like standing water-bred mosquitoes. "I know exactly what I bought," Ryan replied, and there was something dangerous in his quiet tone. "A woman who deserves better than what your town had to offer." Douglas Diaz shifted nervously in his saddle. As both mayor and deputy sheriff, he was caught between his official duties and his personal loyalties. "Now, Ryan, is it? Let's be reasonable here. Eric's got a point about the auction. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Ryan asked, though his rifle never wavered from its ready position. Frank Patel spoke up from behind Evans. "You give us the woman, and we'll give you back $40. That's fair, considering you're an outsider and don't understand our ways." "And if I refuse?" Evans' grin was wolfish in the torchlight. "Then we take her anyway, and you can explain to the coyotes why you thought $50 was worth dying for." Catherine watched Ryan's shoulders tense, saw his finger move closer to the trigger of his rifle. She had never seen violence up close, had never witnessed the moment when words stopped working and men resorted to bullets to settle their differences. The thought of blood being spilled over her, of Ryan dying because he had tried to help her, made her stomach twist with nausea. "Wait," she called out, rising from behind the log despite Ryan's earlier instructions. "Please just wait." All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Evan's expression was triumphant, as if her appearance proved his point about her character. Diaz looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Frank Patel's face was calculating, already considering how to profit from whatever arrangement they might reach. "Catherine, get down," Ryan said sharply, but she ignored him. "Mr. Evans," she said, stepping into the circle of torchlight, "what exactly do you want from me?" Evans's grin widened. "What I wanted from the start. A woman to keep house and warm my bed. My children need a mother, and I need a wife. That's the natural order of things. And if I refuse—" "You don't get to refuse," Evans said flatly. "You're property now, bought and paid for. The only question is who owns you." Catherine felt something cold and hard settle in her chest at his words. Property. Owned. As if she were no different from a horse or a piece of furniture. She looked at the faces surrounding her, these men who had known her all her life, who had watched her grow up and struggle and survive. Not one of them showed even a flicker of sympathy for her situation. "I see," she said quietly. "And what about you, Mr. Diaz? As the law in Millbrook, do you agree that I'm property to be traded between men?" Diaz shifted uncomfortably. "The auction was legal," he said, not meeting her eyes. "But maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone." "Everyone except me, you mean?" "Now, Catherine," Frank Patel said in what he probably thought was a soothing tone, "you're being dramatic. Eric's offering you a good home, children to care for. What more could a woman want?" Catherine thought of Heather Alvarez, Evans's first wife, and the bruises she had tried so hard to hide. She thought of the fear in the woman's eyes whenever her husband raised his voice, the way she had grown thinner and more nervous with each passing year until death had finally released her from her marriage. "What I want," Catherine said clearly, "is to be treated like a human being instead of livestock. What I want is the right to choose my own path. What I want is for you to leave us alone and go back to your dying town." Evans's face darkened at her words. "Dying town? You ungrateful little witch. That town fed you and sheltered you when you had nothing. And this is how you repay that kindness?" "Kindness?" Catherine felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and liberating. "You call it kindness to auction off women like cattle? You call it kindness to drive people from their homes when they can't pay taxes on land that won't grow crops? Your town is dying because of men like you, Mr. Evans. Men who would rather blame others for their failures than face the truth about themselves." The silence that followed her words was electric with tension. Evans's knuckles were white where he gripped his shotgun, and Catherine could see the fury building in his eyes. She had gone too far, said too much, but she found she did not care. For the first time in her life, she had spoken the truth without fear of the consequences. "That's enough," Evans snarled, raising his weapon. "I'm taking what's mine, and if anyone tries to stop me, they'll answer to this." "Over my dead body," Ryan said, and his rifle swung to cover Evans directly. The moment stretched taut, balanced on the edge of violence. Catherine could hear the horses snorting and stamping, could smell the acrid smoke from the torches and the sharp scent of fear sweat from the men. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and blood would flow in the quiet grove. Then from somewhere in the darkness beyond the torchlight came the sound of a rifle being cocked. "I'd reconsider that position if I were you, Evans." The voice was calm, authoritative, and completely unfamiliar. Catherine saw the four men from Millbrook spin in their saddles, trying to locate the speaker, but the darkness beyond their torches was impenetrable. "Who's there?" Diaz called out, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Show yourself." "I don't think that's necessary just yet," the voice replied. "But I will say this. You boys are a long way from home, and you're outnumbered." "Outnumbered?" Evans laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "There's four of us and one of you. Is there now?" Another voice spoke from a different direction, this one with a slight accent that Catherine could not place. "You might want to count again." A third voice joined in from yet another position. "Seems to me like you fellas are surrounded." Catherine watched the men from Millbrook look around wildly, trying to spot their hidden opponents. Their horses were becoming increasingly agitated, sensing the tension and the presence of strangers in the darkness. Frank Patel's torch wavered in his shaking hand, casting wild shadows that made everything seem to move and shift. "This is a private matter," Evans called out, but his bluster was fading fast. "We're just collecting property that belongs to one of us." "Property?" The first voice sounded amused. "That's an interesting way to describe a lady. Where I come from, we call that kidnapping." Ryan had not moved from his position, but Catherine could see the relief in the set of his shoulders. Whoever these men were, he knew them, and their presence had shifted the balance of power dramatically. "You know these men?" she asked quietly. "I do," Ryan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're friends." "Friends who just happened to be in the area?" Evans demanded. "That's a hell of a coincidence." "Not really," Ryan said, and now there was something almost like amusement in his voice. "You see, Evans, you're not the only one who can track someone. My friends have been following you since you left Millbrook." Checkpoint 6. The revelation hit the men from Millbrook like a physical blow. They had been so focused on pursuing Ryan and Catherine that they had never considered they might be the ones being hunted. Diaz looked around nervously, clearly calculating their chances of fighting their way out of the situation. "What do you want?" he asked, his official authority crumbling in the face of superior numbers and tactics. "We want you to turn around and go home," the first hidden voice replied. "We want you to forget you ever saw these people, and we want you to spread the word in Millbrook that anyone else who comes looking for trouble will find more than they bargained for." "You can't threaten us," Evans blustered, but his shotgun was no longer pointed at Ryan. "We're officers of the law." "Are you now?" There was definite amusement in the voice now. "Diaz there might have a badge, but what about the rest of you? Last I checked, saloon owners and farmers don't have the authority to chase people across county lines." Frank Patel cleared his throat nervously. "Maybe we should consider their offer, Eric. It's getting late, and we've got a long ride back to town." "I'm not leaving without the woman," Evans said stubbornly. "Then you're not leaving at all," Ryan said, his rifle still trained on Evans' chest. "Your choice." Catherine watched the standoff continue, feeling like a spectator at some deadly theater. She had never imagined that her simple existence could lead to such violence, such hatred. All she had ever wanted was to live quietly, to make her own way in the world without causing trouble for anyone. Yet here were men willing to kill and die over the right to own her. "There's something you should know, Evans," Ryan said into the tense silence. "Something about why I was really in Millbrook today." "I don't care why you were there," Evans snapped. "You had no right to interfere." "I had every right," Ryan replied. "You see, I wasn't just passing through. I was sent there." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Sent there? By whom? And why? "Sent by who?" Diaz asked, voicing the question that was burning in everyone's mind. "By people who don't like to see women treated as property," Ryan said. "People who have resources and connections that reach far beyond your little town. People who knew exactly what was happening in Millbrook and decided to do something about it." Evans's face had gone pale in the torchlight. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Tell me, Evans, how did word of your auction spread so far so fast? How did people in the next county know about it? How did the territorial governor's office hear about what you were doing?" Catherine saw the fear creep into Evans' eyes at the mention of the territorial governor. Millbrook was a small town, barely a dot on most maps, but it was still subject to territorial law. If word of the auctions had reached the capital, there could be serious consequences for everyone involved. "The governor doesn't care about a few unmarried women," Frank Patel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Doesn't he?" One of the hidden voices spoke up. "Funny thing about governors, they tend to care a lot about how their territory is perceived by Washington, and selling women at auction doesn't exactly paint a civilized picture." Diaz was looking increasingly uncomfortable. As the town's official representative, he would bear the brunt of any investigation or punishment that came down from the territorial government. "Now see here," he said, "the auctions were legal under town ordinance. We followed proper procedures." "Town ordinances don't supersede territorial law," Ryan said, "and territorial law is very clear about the rights of citizens, regardless of their marital status or gender." Catherine listened to this exchange with growing amazement. She had never heard anyone speak of women's rights as if they were real, concrete things protected by law. In Millbrook, women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and grateful for whatever protection men chose to offer them. The idea that there might be laws specifically designed to protect her was revolutionary. "You're bluffing," Evans said, but there was desperation in his voice now. Even if the governor cared, which he doesn't, it would take weeks for word to reach him and longer for him to do anything about it. Would it? Ryan smiled, and in the flickering torchlight, the expression was almost predatory. "How long do you think it takes for a telegraph message to travel, Evans?" The bottom fell out of Evans' world with those words. Catherine could see it in his face, the sudden realization that he might have made a terrible mistake. Telegraph lines had reached the territorial capital 2 years ago, and news could now travel across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. "You sent a telegram?" Diaz asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Several, actually," Ryan replied. "To the governor's office, to the territorial marshal, and to a few newspaper editors who are always interested in stories about frontier justice. I imagine by now there are quite a few people who know exactly what's been happening in Millbrook." The silence that followed was broken only by the nervous stamping of horses and the distant call of a nightbird. Catherine could see the fight going out of the men from Millbrook as they realized the scope of what they were facing. This was no longer a simple matter of retrieving runaway property. This had become a political and legal nightmare that could destroy them all. "What do you want?" Diaz asked finally, his official composure completely shattered. "I want you to go home," Ryan said. "I want you to end the auctions immediately. I want you to find other solutions to your town's problems, solutions that don't involve treating human beings as commodities. And I want you to make sure that word spreads throughout the territory that Millbrook has learned the error of its ways." "And if we do all that," Frank Patel asked, "then maybe those telegrams get lost in transmission. Maybe the territorial marshal decides he has more pressing matters to attend to. Maybe the newspaper editors find other stories to tell." Evans was staring at Ryan with undisguised hatred. "You've destroyed us," he said. "Without the auctions, the town will go bankrupt. People will starve." "People were already starving," Catherine said, speaking up for the first time in several minutes. "The auctions weren't solving your problems, Mr. Evans. They were just making you feel better about them." "What would you know about it?" Evans snarled. "You've never had to make the hard choices, never had to sacrifice for the good of the community. Haven't I?" Catherine stepped closer to the torchlight, her anger giving her courage. "I've watched my friends and neighbors turn their backs on me because I was inconvenient. I've seen families torn apart by poverty and desperation. I've lived on charity and scraps while men like you convinced yourselves that selling women was somehow noble. Don't you dare tell me I don't understand sacrifice." Her words hung in the air like an accusation, and Catherine could see their impact on the faces of the men from Millbrook. Even Evans seemed taken aback by her vehemence. "The lady makes a good point," one of the hidden voices observed. "Seems to me like she's sacrificed plenty already." "More than her share," another voice agreed. Diaz looked around at his companions, clearly searching for a way out of the situation that would preserve what little dignity they had left. "If we agree to your terms," he said to Ryan, "how do we know you'll keep your word about the telegrams?" "You don't," Ryan replied bluntly. "You'll just have to trust me, the same way Catherine had to trust me when she decided to come with me." "That's not much of a guarantee," Frank Patel complained. "It's the only one you're going to get," Ryan said. "And frankly, it's more than you deserve after what you've put this woman through." Catherine watched the men from Millbrook exchange glances, saw the silent communication that passed between them. They were beaten, and they knew it. The question now was whether they would accept defeat gracefully or try to salvage something from the wreckage of their plans. "All right," Diaz said finally. "We'll go back to town. We'll end the auctions. But I want your word that no harm will come to Millbrook because of this." "You have it," Ryan said, "as long as you keep your end of the bargain." Evans was still glaring at them with undisguised fury, but even he seemed to recognize that further resistance was futile. "This isn't over," he said, his voice thick with promise. "Yes, it is," Ryan replied calmly, "and if you're smart, you'll make sure it stays that way." The men from Millbrook began to turn their horses, preparing to leave the grove. But as they did, Evans looked directly at Catherine, his eyes burning with malice. "You think you've won something here," he said, But you're still nothing but a whore who sold herself to the highest bidder. That's all you'll ever be. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, bringing back all the shame and humiliation she had felt standing on those courthouse steps. For a moment, she was that frightened, desperate woman again, willing to go with any man who would offer her shelter from the storm of her life. Then Ryan stepped forward, his rifle now pointed directly at Evans's head. "Apologize," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'll be damned if I apologize. Now." Checkpoint 7. The grove fell silent except for the crackling of the dying fire and the nervous breathing of horses. Catherine could see the calculation in Evan's eyes, the weighing of pride against survival. Around them, she could sense the hidden men shifting position, ready to act if the situation deteriorated further. "I'm sorry," Evan said finally, the words torn from him like pieces of his soul. "Not to me," Ryan said. "To her." Evans looked at Catherine, and she could see the hatred burning in his eyes like banked coals. But he was trapped, surrounded by men who would not hesitate to kill him if he pushed too far. "I apologize, Miss Moore," he said, each word dripping with false sincerity. Catherine nodded once, accepting the hollow apology for what it was worth. She knew that Evans would never truly be sorry for his words or his actions, but hearing him forced to back down gave her a small measure of satisfaction. "Now go," Ryan said, "and remember what I told you about spreading the word." The men from Millbrook turned their horses and rode out of the grove, their torchlight fading into the distance. Catherine watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They were gone for now, but Evans's parting words had made it clear that he considered this defeat temporary. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, 3 men emerged from the darkness beyond the fire. Catherine got her first look at Ryan's mysterious friends, the men who had turned a potential massacre into a bloodless victory. The first was tall and lean like Ryan, with graying hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. He carried his rifle with casual competence, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to violence, but not eager for it. The second man was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of easy smile that suggested he found humor in most situations. His clothes were better quality than the others, and there was something about his bearing that spoke of education and refinement. The third man was different from the other two. He was shorter and stockier, with black hair and features that suggested Native American heritage. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural hunter, and his dark eyes seemed to take in everything at once. "Catherine," Ryan said, "I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. This is Marcus Webb," he indicated the older man. "James Mitchell," he nodded toward the younger one, "and Thomas Crowfeather." Catherine nodded to each man in turn, still trying to process everything that had happened. "Thank you," she said, "all of you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." "Nothing good," Marcus Webb said grimly. "Men like Evans don't take no for an answer easily." "How did you know to follow them?" Catherine asked. James Mitchell grinned. "We didn't follow them. We followed you. Ryan sent word that he might need backup, so we've been keeping an eye on things from a distance." "You've been watching us all day?" "Since you left Millbrook," Thomas Crowfeather confirmed. His voice was quiet and precise, with only a slight accent to hint at his heritage. "We wanted to make sure you made it safely to the ranch." Catherine looked at Ryan with new eyes. "You planned all of this." "Not all of it," Ryan said. "I hoped we could make the trip without trouble, but I've learned it's better to be prepared for the worst." "The telegrams you mentioned," Catherine said, "were they real?" Ryan's smile was enigmatic. "What do you think?" Before Catherine could answer, Marcus Webb spoke up. "We should get moving. Evans and his friends might decide to come back with reinforcements, and I'd rather not be here if they do." "Moving where?" Catherine asked. "I thought we were camping here for the night." "Change of plans," Ryan said. "There's an old line shack about 5 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's got walls and a roof, and it's easily defensible." They quickly broke camp, packing their supplies and saddling the horses. Catherine found herself mounted behind Thomas Crowfeather, whose horse was steady and sure-footed in the darkness. The other men rode in a loose formation around them, their rifles ready and their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. The line shack turned out to be a small log cabin tucked into a fold of hills, barely visible until they were almost on top of it. It was clearly abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but the walls were solid and there was only one way in or out. "Home, sweet home," James Mitchell said cheerfully as they dismounted. "At least for tonight." They settled into the cabin, building a small fire in the stone fireplace and arranging their bedrolls on the dusty floor. Catherine found herself studying her rescuers, trying to understand who they were and why they had risked their lives for a stranger. "You're not just friends, are you?" she said finally. "You're something else. Something more organized." The four men exchanged glances and Catherine could see the silent communication that passed between them. Finally, Ryan spoke. "We're part of an organization," he said carefully. "People who believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances." "What kind of organization?" "The kind that doesn't officially exist," Marcus Webb said dryly. "The kind that operates in the spaces between what's legal and what's right." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Are you outlaws?" "That depends on who you ask," James Mitchell said with his easy grin. "The territorial government considers us helpful citizens. Local authorities sometimes have different opinions." "We help people who can't help themselves," Thomas Crow Feather added. "Women in situations like yours, families being driven off their land by corrupt officials, anyone who's being crushed by people with more power and fewer scruples." "Like vigilantes?" "Like men who believe in justice," Ryan said firmly. "Sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes good people need to stand up and do what's right, even if it's not strictly legal." Catherine absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the quiet, respectful man who had bought her freedom with the idea of him as some kind of outlaw hero. It explained so much about the day's events, from his willingness to pay $50 for a stranger to his friend's timely appearance in the grove. "The ranch you mentioned," she said. "Is it real?" "Very real," Ryan assured her. "Everything I told you about it was true. I do need a housekeeper, and I do intend to pay you $5 a month plus room and board." "And the other things? The work you do with your friends?" "That's separate," Ryan said. "You're not part of that unless you choose to be. Your job is to keep house and cook meals. Nothing more." Catherine looked around at the four men, these unlikely knights errant who had risked their lives to protect her from Eric Evans and his crude demands. They were offering her something she had never had before, a choice, a real choice, with no hidden strings or unspoken expectations. "What if I wanted to be part of it?" she asked quietly. "What if I wanted to help other people the way you help me?" The men exchanged another round of glances, this one longer and more intense. Catherine could sense the debate that was happening without words, the weighing of risks and possibilities. "It's dangerous work," Marcus Webb said finally. "People like Evans don't forgive easily, and there are others like him throughout the territory. Men who see women as property and anyone who disagrees as a threat to their way of life." "I've been in danger my whole life," Catherine replied. "At least this way, I'd be doing something about it instead of just enduring it." "You'd need training," Thomas Crowfeather said. "How to shoot, how to ride, how to defend yourself, how to blend in and gather information without arousing suspicion." "I can learn." "It's not a game," James Mitchell warned, his usual humor replaced by deadly seriousness. "People die doing this work. Good people. People with families and futures ahead of them." "People die anyway," Catherine said. "They die from poverty and desperation and abuse. They die from being treated like animals instead of human beings. At least your way, their deaths might mean something." Ryan had been listening to this exchange in silence, but now he spoke up. "The decision doesn't have to be made tonight," he said. "Come to the ranch, learn what the work involves, see if it's really what you want. There's no shame in choosing a quiet life over a dangerous one." Catherine nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words. She had made enough impulsive decisions for one day, but even as she agreed to wait, she could feel something stirring inside her, a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she was being offered the chance to be more than just a victim of circumstance. Checkpoint. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast through the night. The four men were on their feet instantly, rifles in hand, while Catherine pressed herself against the back wall of the cabin. "How many?" Ryan whispered to Thomas Crowfeather, who had moved to the broken window. "6, maybe 7, came the quiet reply. "Coming from the south." "Evans?" Marcus Webb asked. "Has to be. Question is, did he bring help or just more of the same?" Catherine felt her heart begin to race again. She had thought they were safe, that Evans had been defeated and would slink back to Millbrook to lick his wounds. But apparently she had underestimated his determination and his pride. "There's another way out of here," James Mitchell said quietly. "Back window leads to a gully that runs north toward the hills. We could slip out and be gone before they know we're not here." "No," Ryan said firmly. "Running just means they'll chase us again. Better to end this here and now." 4 against 7 isn't great odds, Marcus Webb pointed out. 5 against 7, Catherine said, surprising herself with the words. All 4 men turned to look at her. "Catherine, you don't know how to fight," Ryan said gently. "I know how to load rifles," she replied. "I know how to tend wounds. I know how to keep watch while you sleep. I may not be a gunfighter, but I'm not useless." The hoofbeats were getting closer now, and Catherine could see the flicker of torchlight through the trees. Evans had indeed brought reinforcements, and from the sound of it, he had managed to recruit more men than she had expected. "All right," Ryan said, making the decision for all of them. "Catherine, you stay in the back corner and keep the spare rifles loaded. Marcus, you take the front window. James, you've got the door. Thomas, you're with me at the side window. Everyone remember, we're not trying to kill anyone unless we have to. We just want to convince them to leave us alone." The men took their positions with practiced efficiency, and Catherine found herself crouched in the corner with an armload of weapons and ammunition. Her hands shook as she began checking the rifles, making sure they were loaded and ready to fire. She had helped her father maintain his hunting rifle as a child, but this was different. This was preparing for war. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the cabin, and Catherine could hear voices in the darkness. Evans was there. She could recognize his harsh tones, but there were others as well. Men she didn't recognize, speaking with accents that suggested they weren't from Millbrook. "We know you're in there," Evans called out. "Come out now and we might let you live." "Might?" Ryan called back. "That's not much of an offer, Evans. It's the only one you're going to get. You've caused enough trouble for one night." Catherine could see Ryan and Thomas Crowfeather at the side window, their rifles trained on the darkness beyond. The torchlight made it difficult to see how many men were out there, but it was clearly more than the 4 they had faced in the grove. "Who are your friends, Evans?" Marcus Webb called from the front window. "Don't recognize their voices. Men who understand that sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands," Evans replied. "Men who don't like outsiders coming into their territory and stirring up trouble." Catherine felt a chill of understanding. These weren't just men from Millbrook seeking revenge. These were hired guns, professionals who made their living with violence. Evans had somehow managed to recruit mercenaries to his cause, which meant the situation had escalated far beyond a simple dispute over an auction. "How much is he paying you?" James Mitchell called out from his position by the door. "Whatever it is, it's not enough to die for." "Nobody's dying if you just come out peaceful," one of the strangers replied. His voice was calm and professional, the tone of a man who had done this kind of work before. "We just want the woman. The rest of you can ride away." "Not happening," Ryan said flatly. "Then I guess we do this the hard way." The first shot came without warning, shattering what remained of the front window and sending Marcus Webb diving for cover. Catherine screamed involuntarily as splinters of wood and glass filled the air, then bit down on her knuckle to keep from making any more noise. The cabin erupted in gunfire as both sides opened up simultaneously. Catherine pressed herself against the back wall, covering her ears against the deafening noise. She could see muzzle flashes through the windows, could smell the acrid smoke of black powder filling the small space. "Catherine!" Ryan shouted over the noise. "I need a loaded rifle." She grabbed the nearest weapon and crawled across the floor toward him, staying low to avoid the bullets that were chewing chunks out of the log walls. Ryan took the rifle without looking away from his target, passing her his empty weapon in return. "Can you see them?" she asked, trying to peer through the smoke and darkness. Some of them, Ryan replied, taking careful aim before firing. They're spread out pretty well, using the trees for cover. Professional work. Catherine crawled back to her corner and began reloading the empty rifle, her hands moving automatically despite her fear. The noise was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. These men were depending on her to keep them supplied with ammunition, and she would not let them down. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Catherine lost track of how many rifles she loaded and passed forward, how many empty weapons she received in return. Her corner of the cabin was littered with brass cartridges and torn paper from ammunition boxes. Then suddenly, the shooting stopped. The silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been, broken only by the ringing in Catherine's ears and the sound of men breathing heavily. "Anyone hurt?" Marcus Webb called out. "I'm good," James Mitchell replied. "Same here," Thomas Crowfeather added. "Catherine?" Ryan asked. "I'm all right," she managed to say, though her voice came out as a croak. "What about them?" Marcus Webb asked, peering cautiously through the shattered window. "Hard to tell," Ryan replied. "I think I hit at least one of them, but they're keeping quiet." The standoff stretched on, neither side willing to expose themselves to enemy fire. Catherine used the lull to reload all the rifles again, her hands steadier now that the immediate danger had passed. She was surprised to discover that she felt calm, almost detached from the situation. The terror she had expected was there, but it was manageable, pushed down by the need to be useful. "You still alive in there?" Evans called out eventually. "Still here," Ryan replied. "You ready to talk sense yet?" "I'm ready to burn you out," Evans said. "Got plenty of torches, and that cabin's dry as tinder." Catherine felt her blood freeze at the words. Fire was every frontier dweller's worst nightmare, especially in a wooden building with limited exits. She looked around the cabin, noting the gaps in the chinking, the dry wood of the walls and roof. If Evans carried out his threat, they would have minutes at most before the structure became uninhabitable. "That would be murder," Marcus Webb pointed out. "That would be justice," Evans replied. "You killed 2 of my men. Eye for an eye, the Bible says." "Your men shot first," Ryan called back. "We were just defending ourselves." "Tell it to their widows." Catherine closed her eyes, trying to think. There had to be a way out of this situation that didn't involve burning to death or surrendering to men who clearly intended to kill them regardless. She thought about the layout of the cabin, the surrounding terrain, the resources they had available. Then she remembered something James Mitchell had mentioned earlier. "The back window," she whispered to Ryan. "The gully he mentioned. Could we make it?" Ryan considered the idea, his eyes calculating distances and angles. "Maybe," he said finally, "but we'd have to move fast and we'd be exposed for the first few yards." "Better than burning," Catherine pointed out. "She's right," Thomas Crowfeather said from his position at the side window. "I can see them gathering brush and deadfall. They're serious about the fire." Ryan made the decision quickly. "All right, we go out the back. Thomas, you go first with Catherine. Marcus and James, you provide covering fire. I'll bring up the rear." They began moving toward the back of the cabin, gathering their essential supplies and abandoning everything else. Catherine slung a rifle across her back and stuffed her pockets with ammunition, knowing that every bullet might mean the difference between life and death. The back window was small and high, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Thomas Crowfeather went first, dropping silently into the darkness beyond. Then he reached back to help Catherine through the opening. The drop was farther than she had expected, and she landed hard in the rocky bottom of the gully. Thomas Crowfeather steadied her with one hand while keeping his rifle ready with the other. The gully was deeper than it had looked from inside the cabin, providing good cover from anyone on level ground. Marcus Webb came through the window next, followed by James Mitchell. Ryan was last, and as he dropped into the gully, Catherine could see the orange glow of flames beginning to lick at the cabin's walls. "They're not wasting any time," Marcus Webb observed grimly. "Neither can we," Ryan replied. "They'll figure out we're gone as soon as the fire gets big enough to light up the interior. We need to be well away from here before that happens." They began moving north along the gully, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. Behind them, Catherine could hear Evans and his men shouting to each other as they fed the growing fire. The flames were spreading quickly, and soon the entire cabin would be engulfed. The gully ran for perhaps a quarter mile before it began to shallow out, forcing them to crawl on their bellies to stay hidden. Catherine's new dress was already torn and dirty, but she didn't care. Clothes could be replaced. Lives could not. When they finally emerged from the gully, they were in a stand of pine trees that provided good cover from observation. In the distance, the burning cabin was a pillar of fire against the night sky, visible for miles around. "That's going to draw attention," James Mitchell pointed out. "Every lawman and curious citizen within 20 miles is going to come investigating." "Good," Ryan said grimly. "Let Evans explain to the territorial marshal why he felt the need to burn down a line shack with people inside it." They retrieved their horses from where they had been hidden in a nearby grove and began riding north toward the hills. Catherine found herself mounted behind Ryan again, her arms around his waist as they navigated the rough terrain in darkness. "Where are we going now?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Ryan replied. "Somewhere Evans and his hired guns can't follow." Checkpoint 9. They rode through the night, following game trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from pursuit. Catherine dozed fitfully against Ryan's back, waking every time the horse stumbled or when distant sounds suggested they might be followed. But the hours passed without incident, and gradually she began to believe they had escaped. Dawn found them high in the hills, looking down on a valley that seemed untouched by human habitation. The morning mist clung to a stream that wound through meadows dotted with wildflowers, and Catherine could see deer grazing in the distance. "Is this your ranch?" she asked. "Part of it," Ryan replied. "The house is another few miles north, but this is all part of the property." Catherine stared at the peaceful scene below them, trying to reconcile it with the violence and terror of the previous night. It seemed impossible that such beauty could exist in the same world as Eric Evans and his hired killers. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It will be even more beautiful when it's properly developed," Ryan said. "Good grass, plenty of water, natural windbreaks. It just needs someone who cares about it." They rode down into the valley as the sun climbed higher, following the stream toward a cluster of buildings that gradually became visible in the distance. Catherine's first glimpse of Ryan's ranch house was disappointing. It was smaller than she had expected, a simple log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch. But as they drew closer, she began to notice the details that spoke of care and attention. The well-chinked walls, the solid roof, the neat garden plot beside the kitchen door. "It's not much yet," Ryan said, clearly noticing her expression. "But it's sound, and there's room to expand." "It looks perfect," Catherine said, and meant it. After the events of the past day, the simple house looked like paradise. They dismounted in front of the porch, and Catherine got her first look at what would be her new home. The interior was sparse but clean, with a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a smaller bedroom, and a loft that could be reached by a ladder. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, and everything was arranged with military precision. "You'll have the bedroom," Ryan said. "I've been sleeping in the loft anyway." Catherine nodded, too tired to argue. The bed looked incredibly inviting after a night of riding, but she forced herself to stay awake long enough to help prepare breakfast. It was the least she could do after everything Ryan and his friends had done for her. As they sat around the rough wooden table eating eggs and bacon, Catherine found herself studying the four men who had risked their lives for her. In the morning light, they looked less like dangerous outlaws and more like ordinary men who had chosen an extraordinary path. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Evans, I mean. Will he keep coming after us?" "Probably not," Marcus Webb said. "Last night cost him money and men. His hired guns are likely long gone by now, and he'll have a hard time explaining the burned cabin to the authorities." "But he'll remember," Thomas Crowfeather added. "Men like Evans don't forgive easily. He may not come after you directly, but he'll be watching for opportunities." "Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't get any," Ryan said firmly. James Mitchell pushed back from the table and stretched. "Well, this has been exciting, but we should probably head back to our own business. The territorial marshal is expecting a report on the situation in Millbrook, and I'd like to get it to him before Evans has a chance to spin his own version of events." The three men prepared to leave, gathering their gear and saddling their horses. Catherine watched them go with mixed feelings. They had been her protectors and allies, and their departure left her feeling vulnerable despite Ryan's presence. "Will I see you again?" she asked as they mounted up. "Count on it," Marcus Webb said with a rare smile. "Ryan's going to need help getting this place running properly, and we're always available for honest work." "Take care of yourself, Catherine," James Mitchell added, "and remember what we talked about. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Thomas Crowfeather simply nodded to her, but there was warmth in his dark eyes that spoke louder than words. After they had ridden away, Catherine found herself alone with Ryan for the first time since leaving Millbrook. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with unspoken questions and possibilities. "So," she said finally, "what happens now?" "Now we get to work," Ryan replied. "There are cattle to round up, fences to mend, and a dozen other tasks that have been waiting for someone with the time to do them properly." "And me? What's my role in all this?" Ryan looked at her seriously. "Whatever you want it to be. I meant what I said about the housekeeper job, but after last night, I think we both know you're capable of more than cooking and cleaning." Catherine felt a flutter of excitement at his words. "You mean the work your friends do? The organization you mentioned?" "If that's what you want. But understand, Catherine, there's no going back once you are committed. The work is dangerous, and the people we help don't always appreciate our methods. You'd be giving up any chance of a normal life." Catherine thought about what constituted a normal life for a woman in her position. Marriage to a man who might or might not treat her well, children who would grow up in poverty, a slow decline into old age and irrelevance. It was not an appealing prospect. "What would I have to do?" she asked. "Learn to defend yourself, first and foremost. Learn to ride well enough to outrun trouble. Learn to gather information without arousing suspicion. Learn to think tactically, to plan operations and anticipate problems." "It sounds like you're describing a soldier." "In a way, that's exactly what I'm describing. We're fighting a war, Catherine, even if it's not the kind that gets written about in history books. We're fighting for the idea that all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances." Catherine looked out the window at the peaceful valley, trying to imagine herself as some kind of warrior for justice. It seemed impossible, but then again, 24 hours ago she would have said it was impossible for her to survive a gunfight or escape from a burning building. "How long do I have to decide?" and she asked. "As long as you need," Ryan said. "For now, just focus on getting settled and learning the ranch. The other decision can wait." Catherine nodded, grateful for his patience. She had been through too much too quickly, and she needed time to process everything that had happened. But even as she told herself to be cautious, she could feel the pull of the life Ryan was offering. For the first time in her existence, she had the chance to be more than just a victim of circumstance. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Ryan was instantly alert, his hand moving to the rifle that hung by the door. But as the riders came into view, Catherine could see that these were not enemies. There were two of them, a man and a woman, both dressed in the practical clothes of ranch workers. "Friends of yours?" Catherine asked. "Neighbors," Ryan replied, relaxing slightly. "John and Mary Patterson. They have a spread about 10 miles east of here." The Pattersons dismounted and approached the porch, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. John Patterson was a big man with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who worked hard for a living. His wife Mary was smaller and younger, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Ryan," John Patterson said, touching the brim of his hat, "we saw smoke in the hills last night. Thought we'd better check and make sure you were all right." "I'm fine, John. Thanks for the concern. This is Catherine Moore, my new housekeeper." Mary Patterson's eyes took in Catherine's torn and dirty dress, the exhaustion in her face, and the rifle she still carried across her back. "Looks like you've had some excitement," she said diplomatically. "You could say that," Ryan replied. "Some men from Millbrook had ideas about taking Catherine back with them. We disagreed." John Patterson's expression darkened. "Millbrook? That's the town that's been auctioning off women, isn't it? Heard talk about it at the territorial capital last week." "The same," Ryan confirmed. "Well, they're not welcome here," Mary Patterson said firmly. "Anyone who treats women like livestock isn't fit to share the same territory with decent people." Catherine felt a warm surge of gratitude toward the older woman. It was the first time since leaving Millbrook that someone had expressed outright condemnation of the auctions, rather than treating them as an unfortunate necessity. "Did you have any trouble with them?" John Patterson asked. "Nothing we couldn't handle," Ryan said. "But they burned down the old line shack up in Willow Creek." "Burned it down?" Mary Patterson looked shocked. "That's destruction of property. The territorial marshal needs to know about this." "He will," Ryan assured her. The Pattersons stayed for another hour, sharing news from the surrounding area and offering help with the ranch work. Catherine found herself liking them immediately. They treated her as an equal, asking her opinion on various matters and including her in their conversation as if she had always been part of the community. After they left, Catherine helped Ryan with the evening chores, learning the routine of ranch life. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way that sewing and mending had never been. There was something deeply appealing about caring for animals and tending to the land, about being part of something larger than herself. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine stood on the porch and looked out at her new home. 24 hours ago, she had been standing on courthouse steps, being sold to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock. Now she was free, safe, and being offered opportunities she had never dreamed of. "Any regrets?" Ryan asked, joining her on the porch. Catherine considered the question seriously. "About leaving Millbrook? None at all. About what happened last night? I wish it could have been resolved without violence, but I understand why it couldn't be. And about coming here?" Catherine looked at him. This quiet man who had risked everything to give her a choice. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Whatever happens next, at least I'll be facing it as a free woman." Ryan nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we start building your new life." Catherine went inside and prepared for bed, her mind still racing despite her exhaustion. As she lay in the comfortable bed, listening to the night sounds of the valley, she found herself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not just surviving from day to day, but actually planning and hoping and dreaming. Outside, she could hear Ryan moving around, checking on the animals and securing the ranch for the night. The sounds were comforting, a reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them with allies beside her and choices before her. For the first time in her adult life, Catherine Moore fell asleep feeling truly safe. The first rays of autumn sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, painting golden squares across the rough wooden floor where Catherine had slept more peacefully than she had in months. She woke to the sound of Ryan moving quietly about the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of someone who had learned to live alone, but had not forgotten how to be considerate of others. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the small space, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply lie there, absorbing the reality of her new circumstances. 3 weeks had passed since that terrible night at the burned line shack. 3 weeks of learning the rhythms of ranch life and discovering strengths within herself she had never known existed. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, had grown calloused from handling rope and tools. Her arms had gained muscle from lifting hay bales and water buckets. Most importantly, her spirit had begun to heal from the wounds inflicted by years of being treated as a burden rather than a person. Ryan had been patient with her learning, never making her feel foolish when she struggled with tasks that seemed simple to him. He had taught her to ride properly, to shoot accurately, and to read the signs that warned of approaching weather or potential danger. But more than that, he had shown her through his actions what it meant to be valued as an equal partner rather than merely tolerated as a necessary inconvenience. This morning felt different, though Catherine could not immediately identify why. There was a tension in Ryan's movements, a watchfulness in the way he glanced toward the windows, that suggested something had changed during the night. She dressed quickly in her practical work clothes and joined him in the kitchen, noting the way his rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. "Trouble?" she asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. "Maybe," Ryan replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Thomas rode in before dawn. There's been activity around Millbrook. Men asking questions, strangers in town spending money they shouldn't have." Catherine felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. She had known this peace could not last forever, that Eric Evans was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. But she had hoped for more time, more opportunity to become the person she was meant to be before the past came calling again. Evans, she asked. Probably, or men working for him. The point is, they're looking for us, and they're not being subtle about it. That means they're either desperate or they think they have enough backing to make subtlety unnecessary. Catherine set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled only slightly. 3 weeks ago, the thought of men hunting her would have sent her into a panic. Now, while the fear was still there, it was tempered by something else. Anger, determination, the knowledge that she was no longer helpless. "What do we do?" she asked. Ryan studied her face carefully, as if weighing her readiness for what he was about to propose. "We have choices," he said finally. "We can run, put distance between us and whatever's coming. We can stay and defend what we've built here, or we can take the fight to them before they bring it to us." The old Catherine, the woman who had stood on those courthouse steps waiting to be sold, would have chosen to run without hesitation. But that woman no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned that running only delayed the inevitable, that some battles had to be fought regardless of the odds. "What would taking the fight to them mean?" she asked. "It would mean going back to Millbrook. It would mean facing Evans and whatever allies he's gathered. It would mean putting ourselves in danger to protect other people who might find themselves in the same situation you were in." Catherine thought of the women still in Millbrook, the ones who had watched her auction with relief that it was not them on the block. She thought of Barbara Martinez and Janet Brown, whispering behind their gloved hands as if her humiliation were entertainment. But she also thought of the younger women, the ones who might find themselves friendless and desperate if the town's situation continued to deteriorate. "The auctions," she said. "Are they still happening?" Ryan's expression darkened. "According to Thomas, they've gotten worse, more frequent, more desperate. And Evans has been positioning himself as the town's protector, the man who's willing to make the hard choices that others won't. He's using what happened with us to build support." "Exactly. He's telling people that outsiders are trying to interfere with their way of life, that they need to band together to protect their traditions. It's working too. Men who might have had doubts about the auctions before are now defending them as a matter of local pride." Catherine felt a surge of fury at the thought of her suffering being twisted into propaganda for Evan's cause. The idea that her escape might have made things worse for other women was almost unbearable. "Then we go back," she said firmly. "We stop this before more people get hurt." Ryan nodded as if he had expected this response. "It won't be easy. Evans has had time to prepare, time to gather allies and resources, and this time, we won't have the element of surprise." "What about Marcus and the others? Will they help?" "They're already on their way. Thomas brought word that they've been tracking the men Evans hired, trying to identify them and understand what we're up against. But Catherine, you need to understand what you're committing to. This isn't just about stopping the auctions. This is about changing the way people think, about challenging beliefs that some of them would rather die than abandon." Catherine walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful valley that had become her sanctuary. In 3 weeks, this place had become more of a home to her than Millbrook had ever been. The thought of leaving it, of walking back into danger, filled her with dread. But the thought of other women suffering as she had suffered filled her with something stronger than dread. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Today. The longer we wait, the more time Evans has to consolidate his position. But first, there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I was really in Millbrook that day." Catherine turned from the window, sensing that whatever Ryan was about to reveal would change everything between them. His expression was serious, almost grave, and she could see the weight of secrets in his dark eyes. "I told you I was sent there by an organization," he began. "What I didn't tell you was that the organization has been watching Millbrook for months. We knew about the auctions, knew about the desperation driving them, and we knew about you." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. "You knew about me specifically?" "We had reports. A woman alone, struggling to survive, likely to be targeted when the town's situation got bad enough. We were monitoring the situation, waiting for the right moment to intervene." Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about their meeting, about Ryan's impulsive decision to help her, was suddenly cast in a different light. So when you bid on me, it wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. The bidding was real, Ryan said quickly. The choice to help you was real. But yes, I was there specifically because of you. Because we believed you deserved better than what Millbrook was offering. The revelation should have made Catherine angry, should have made her feel manipulated and deceived. Instead, she found herself feeling something else entirely. Relief, gratitude, the knowledge that someone had cared enough about her welfare to plan and prepare and risk their lives. How long have you been watching me? She asked. Since your parents died. We knew that when the town's resources got tight enough, unmarried women would be the first to suffer. We identified the ones most at risk and made plans to help them if we could. The ones most at risk. How many others were there? Ryan's silence was answer enough. Catherine closed her eyes, imagining other women in other towns, facing the same desperation and humiliation she had endured. The scope of the problem was larger than she had realized, and the need for action more urgent. That's why we have to go back, she said. It's not just about Millbrook anymore. It's about sending a message that this kind of treatment won't be tolerated anywhere. It's dangerous, Catherine. More dangerous than anything we've faced so far. Evans isn't just fighting for his own pride anymore. He's fighting for a way of life, and men will do terrible things to preserve what they see as their natural order. Catherine thought of Heather Alvarez, Evans's first wife, and the fear that had lived in her eyes. She thought of all the women who had accepted lesser lives because they believed they had no other choice. She thought of the girls growing up in towns like Millbrook, learning that their value was measured only by their usefulness to men. Then we'd better make sure we win, she said. Checkpoint 11. They spent the morning preparing for the journey, packing supplies and weapons with the methodical care of people who understood that their lives might depend on being properly equipped. Catherine found herself moving with a confidence she had never possessed before, checking her rifle and ammunition with the competence of someone who had learned to take responsibility for her own protection. The transformation was not lost on Ryan, who watched her preparations with something that might have been pride. 3 weeks ago, she had been a frightened woman who flinched at loud noises and jumped at shadows. Now she was someone who could be counted on in a crisis, someone who had earned her place as an equal partner in whatever lay ahead. Marcus Webb, James Mitchell, and Thomas Crowfeather arrived at midday, their horses lathered from hard riding and their faces grim with purpose. They brought news that confirmed Ryan's worst fears about the situation in Millbrook. Evans has been busy, Marcus reported as they gathered around the kitchen table. He's brought in at least a dozen hired guns, professionals who don't care about local politics as long as they're paid. He's also been spreading money around town, buying loyalty and silence from people who might otherwise have opposed him. What about the territorial marshal? Catherine asked. Didn't James say he was going to investigate? James Mitchell's expression was dark. He tried, sent a deputy to ask questions, but the man was met with a wall of silence. Everyone in town suddenly developed amnesia about the auctions and the burned line shack. The deputy found no evidence of wrongdoing and no one willing to testify to anything. So Evans has effectively made himself untouchable through intimidation and bribery, Ryan said. For now, Thomas Crowfeather agreed, but his position is more fragile than it appears. The money he's spending has to come from somewhere, and small towns don't generate that kind of cash flow naturally. He's either borrowed heavily or he's got backing from outside sources. Outside sources like who? Catherine asked. Men who profit from keeping women powerless, Marcus replied bluntly. Businessmen who rely on cheap labor, politicians who benefit from traditional power structures, anyone who sees women's independence as a threat to their interests. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What Catherine had thought was a local problem driven by desperation was apparently part of something much larger and more sinister. The auctions in Millbrook were not an aberration, but a symptom of a systematic effort to roll back what few rights women had managed to gain. So what's the plan? She asked. Ryan spread a hand-drawn map of Millbrook and the surrounding area on the table. We go in quietly, gather intelligence, and identify Evans's weaknesses. Then we exploit those weaknesses to turn the town against him. And if that doesn't work, Catherine asked, then we make sure he can't hurt anyone else, Marcus said grimly. They spent the afternoon reviewing the plan, identifying potential allies and threats, discussing contingencies and escape routes. Catherine found herself contributing ideas and observations that the men took seriously, her intimate knowledge of the town and its people proving valuable in ways she had never imagined. As the sun began to set, they saddled their horses and prepared to ride. Catherine took one last look at the peaceful valley that had been her sanctuary, knowing that she might never see it again. The thought should have filled her with regret, but instead she felt only determination. This place had given her the strength and confidence she needed to face what lay ahead. Now it was time to use those gifts. The ride to Millbrook took most of the night, the five of them moving through the darkness, like ghosts, avoiding main roads and keeping to game trails that would hide their passage. Catherine found herself thinking about the last time she had made this journey, bound and frightened, with no idea what the future held. The contrast with her current situation was so stark it almost made her laugh. They made camp in the same grove where Ryan had first offered her employment, the irony of the location not lost on any of them. But this time, Catherine was not a helpless victim waiting to be rescued. She was an active participant in her own fate, armed and trained and ready to fight for what she believed in. "Second thoughts?" Ryan asked as they settled in for a few hours of rest before dawn. "None," Catherine replied, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to do." Dawn brought with it the sound of church bells from Millbrook, calling the faithful to Sunday services. Catherine listened to the familiar chimes and felt a pang of something that was not quite nostalgia. That sound had once meant safety and community to her. Now it seemed like a mockery, a pretense of righteousness covering up the ugliness beneath. "Perfect timing," James Mitchell observed. "Everyone will be in church, making it easier for us to move around unnoticed." They split up as they approached the town, each taking a different route and objective. Thomas Crow Feather would scout the outskirts, looking for Evans's hired guns and identifying their positions. Marcus Webb would observe the church service, noting who was present and how they were behaving. James Mitchell would investigate the financial situation, trying to trace the source of Evans's sudden wealth. Ryan and Catherine would go directly to the heart of the matter, Evans himself. They entered Millbrook from the east, using the cover of abandoned buildings and overgrown lots to avoid detection. The town looked even more desperate than when Catherine had left it, with more boarded windows and empty shops. But there were also signs of recent activity, fresh lumber, new construction, the kind of improvements that required significant investment. "He's been busy," Catherine murmured as they crept through the shadows. "Too busy," Ryan agreed. "The question is whether he's building something sustainable or just putting on a show." They made their way to the church, a simple wooden structure that had served the community for over 20 years. Through the windows, they could see the congregation gathered for Sunday service, their faces upturned toward the pulpit where Reverend Michael Torres was delivering his sermon. But it was not the Reverend's words that caught Catherine's attention. It was the man sitting in the front pew, his posture radiating authority and confidence. Eric Evans, dressed in his Sunday best, looking for all the world like a pillar of the community rather than the desperate, violent man she remembered from that night in the grove. "He's cleaned up his image," she whispered to Ryan. "Appearances matter in small towns," Ryan replied. "If he can convince people that he's respectable, they'll be more willing to overlook his methods." They watched as the service concluded and the congregation began to file out. Catherine recognized many of the faces, people who had known her all her life but had stood silent while she was auctioned off like livestock. Some looked genuinely prosperous, better dressed and better fed than she remembered. Others looked nervous, as if they were playing roles they were not entirely comfortable with. Evans emerged from the church surrounded by a small group of supporters, men who hung on his every word and laughed at his jokes with the enthusiasm of people who knew which side their bread was buttered on. Catherine noticed that several of them were strangers, men with the hard faces and watchful eyes of professional fighters. "There," she said, pointing to a tall man with a scar across his left cheek. "That one wasn't here before." "None of them were," Ryan confirmed. "Evans has definitely brought in outside help." They followed the group at a distance as it made its way toward the town square, where a small crowd was gathering around a makeshift platform. Catherine's heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. Another auction, another woman about to be sold to the highest bidder. The victim this time was young, probably no more than 19, with the pale, frightened look of someone who had not eaten well in weeks. Catherine recognized her as Sarah Chen, whose parents had died in a wagon accident the previous winter. The girl had been living on charity since then, just as Catherine had, and now she was facing the same fate. "We have to stop this," Catherine said, her hand moving instinctively to her rifle. "Not yet," Ryan said firmly. "If we act now, we'll save one woman but lose the chance to stop all the others. We need to be smart about this." Catherine knew he was right, but watching Sarah Chen's terror brought back all her own memories of standing on those courthouse steps. The girl's hands were shaking as Timothy Rogers, the auctioneer, began his familiar spiel about efficiency measures and community resources. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rogers called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we come today to another necessary action for the good of our community. Miss Sarah Chen, aged 19, unmarried, and by town ordinance deemed a burden upon our resources." The crowd's response was different this time. There was less of the uncomfortable shuffling Catherine remembered from her own auction, more of an eager anticipation that suggested the practice had become normalized. Evans had succeeded in making the unthinkable seem reasonable. "The bidding will start at $10, Rogers announced. "Miss Chen is young and healthy, capable of bearing children and maintaining a household." The first bid came from Frank Patel, just as Catherine had expected. But this time, the saloon owner was not content with a single offer. The bidding quickly escalated, with several men competing for the right to own Sarah Chen. Catherine watched in horror as the price climbed higher and higher, the men treating the girl's life as if it were a commodity to be traded for profit. Sarah herself stood silent on the platform, tears streaming down her face as her fate was decided by strangers. "$50, called out a voice Catherine did not recognize. One of Evans's hired guns, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. The bidding continued, reaching levels that would have been unthinkable during Catherine's auction. Clearly, Evans's financial backing was allowing his supporters to bid aggressively, ensuring that the auctions remained profitable for the town. $100, Eric Evans himself entered the bidding, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The other bidders fell silent, recognizing that they could not compete with Evans' resources. Sarah Chen looked up at him with undisguised terror, clearly recognizing him as the man responsible for her current situation. $100 going once, Rogers called out. Going twice. Catherine could stand it no longer. Before Ryan could stop her, she stepped out of their hiding place and into the town square, her rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "Stop!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. The crowd turned as one, gasps and exclamations rippling through the gathering as they recognized her. Catherine Moore, the woman who had escaped, who had defied their system and lived to tell about it. She could see the shock on their faces, the fear and uncertainty that her presence brought. Evans's reaction was immediate and violent. His hand went to the gun at his hip, his face contorting with rage and hatred. "You!" he snarled. "You should have stayed away." "I should have," Catherine agreed, walking slowly toward the platform. "But I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't let you destroy more lives to feed your own pride." "Pride?" Evans laughed harshly. "This isn't about pride, you stupid woman. This is about survival, about doing what needs to be done to keep this community alive." "By selling human beings like cattle?" Catherine's voice carried across the square, reaching every ear. "By treating women as property to be bought and sold? That's not survival, Mr. Evans. That's barbarism." Checkpoint 12. The crowd was murmuring now, some voices raised in support of Evans, others expressing doubt and uncertainty. Catherine could see the division in their faces, the conflict between what they had been told was necessary and what they knew in their hearts was wrong. "You don't understand," Barbara Martinez called out from the crowd. "The town was dying. The auctions brought in money, brought in new people. They saved us." "Did they?" Catherine asked, turning to face the woman who had once been her neighbor. Look around you, Barbara. Look at what you've become. You're selling your daughters and your neighbors to strangers. You're living in fear of your own government. Is that really salvation? It's better than starving, Frank Patel interjected. Better than watching our children waste away while we pretend everything is fine. There are other ways, Catherine said. Ways that don't require sacrificing your humanity. But you'll never find them as long as you let men like Evans convince you that women are expendable. Evans had heard enough. His gun cleared its holster with practiced speed, the barrel swinging toward Catherine's chest. But she was ready for him, had been expecting this moment since she stepped into the square. Her own rifle came up smoothly, and suddenly the two of them were facing each other across 20 feet of dusty ground, each with a weapon trained on the other. You made a mistake coming back here, Evans said, his voice deadly quiet. This time, there's no one to save you. I'm not here to be saved, Catherine replied. I'm here to do the saving. The standoff stretched taut between them, the crowd falling silent as they realized they were about to witness something that would change their town forever. Catherine could feel the weight of every eye upon her, could sense the fear and anticipation that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Then Ryan stepped into the square, his rifle trained on Evans's back. Actually, she's not alone. Evans' eyes flicked toward Ryan, recognizing him immediately. The stranger. I should have killed you that night in the grove. You tried, Ryan replied calmly. Didn't work out so well for you, as I recall. More figures emerged from the shadows around the square. Marcus Webb, James Mitchell, and Thomas Crowfeather, each taking position to cover a different angle. The hired guns Evans had brought in began reaching for their weapons, but found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. 5 against 12, Evans said, his confidence returning as he calculated the odds. I like those numbers. Do you? Marcus Webb asked mildly. You might want to count again. As if summoned by his words, more figures began appearing around the square. John and Mary Patterson, the ranchers who had visited Catherine at Ryan's spread. Several other families from the surrounding area, people who had been quietly organizing while Evans was focused on his hired guns. Even some residents of Millbrook itself, people who had grown tired of living in fear and shame. You see, Eric, Ryan said conversationally, while you've been busy buying loyalty with blood money, we've been talking to people, reminding them what this community used to stand for, what it could stand for again. Evans looked around the square, seeing his support evaporating as more and more people stepped forward to stand with Catherine and her allies. His hired guns were still dangerous, but they were professionals who fought for money, not conviction. Faced with overwhelming odds and no clear path to victory, they began to hesitate. This is still my town, Evans said desperately. These people depend on me. Without the auctions, without the money they bring in, Millbrook will die. Millbrook is already dead, Catherine said sadly. You killed it when you decided that women were commodities to be sold. What's left is just a shell, a mockery of what a community should be. Then what do you propose? Douglas Diaz stepped forward, his mayor's badge catching the sunlight. How do we survive without the revenue from the auctions? The same way every other community survives, James Mitchell said, producing a sheaf of papers from his jacket. Through honest work, fair trade, and cooperation with your neighbors. I have here a proposal for a territorial development grant, funding for infrastructure improvements and agricultural support. All it requires is an end to practices that violate territorial law. The crowd stirred with interest at the mention of legitimate funding. Catherine could see hope beginning to replace fear in their faces, the possibility that there might be a future that did not require sacrificing their souls. You're lying, Evans said, but his voice lacked conviction. The territorial government doesn't care about places like Millbrook. They care about places that follow the law and treat their citizens with dignity, James replied. They care about communities that contribute to the territory's reputation rather than embarrassing it. Evans's grip on his gun was wavering now, his eyes darting between the faces surrounding him. Catherine could see the moment when he realized that his support had crumbled, that the people he had thought he controlled had chosen a different path. Sarah, Catherine said gently, addressing the girl who was still standing on the auction platform, you don't have to do this. You have choices now. Sarah Chen looked up with tear-filled eyes, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. Choices? Come down from there, Catherine said, extending her hand. Come stand with people who see you as a human being, not property. Sarah took a tentative step forward, then another. Evans swung his gun toward her, his face contorting with rage. You stay right there, girl. You belong to this town, and this town needs the money. No, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I belong to myself. She jumped down from the platform and ran toward Catherine, who caught her in a protective embrace. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in the square. The victim had become a person, the property had claimed her freedom, and the system that had oppressed them both was crumbling. Evans's last shred of control snapped. With a roar of fury, he swung his gun back toward Catherine, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Thomas Crow Feather was faster, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. Evans staggered, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt. You've killed us all, he gasped, sinking to his knees in the dust. Without the money, without the system, this town will die. Then we'll build a new one, Catherine said, kneeling beside him despite everything he had done to her. One that doesn't require the sacrifice of innocent people. Evans looked up at her, confusion replacing the hatred in his eyes. Why? He whispered. After everything I did to you, why show me mercy? Because that's what human beings do, Catherine replied. We choose compassion over cruelty, even when cruelty seems easier. Evans died as the sun reached its zenith, his last breath carrying away the old order that had ruled Millbrook through fear and desperation. Around the square, his hired guns were surrendering their weapons, recognizing that their employer was gone and their cause was lost. The transformation that followed was not immediate, but it was inevitable. With Evans dead and his system discredited, the people of Millbrook began the difficult work of rebuilding their community on a foundation of justice rather than exploitation. The territorial development grant that James Mitchell had promised proved real, bringing jobs and investment that made the auctions unnecessary as well as illegal. Catherine found herself at the center of these changes, her story becoming a symbol of what was possible when people chose to stand up for what was right. She worked with Mary Patterson and other women to establish a network of support for those in need, ensuring that no one would ever again face the desperation that had driven the auctions. But perhaps the most significant change was in Catherine herself. The frightened woman who had stood on the courthouse steps 3 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered her own strength and purpose. She had learned that she was worth more than $50, worth more than any price that could be placed on a human life. Checkpoint 13. 6 months after the confrontation in Millbrook's town square, Catherine stood on the porch of Ryan's ranch house, watching the sun set over the valley that had become her true home. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and she smiled as she recognized the riders coming up the trail. Marcus Webb, James Mitchell, and Thomas Crow Feather had become regular visitors to the ranch, their work with the organization bringing them through the area on a regular basis. But today they were not alone. Behind them rode Sarah Chen, now a confident young woman who had chosen to join their cause rather than return to the life of dependency that Millbrook had offered her. Any word from the territorial capital? Catherine asked as they dismounted and gathered on the porch. Good news, James Mitchell replied with his characteristic grin. The governor has signed legislation banning the auction of human beings throughout the territory. What happened in Millbrook was apparently the last straw. And the other towns? The ones where similar practices were taking place? Most have ended the auctions voluntarily once word spread about what happened here, Marcus Webb reported. The few holdouts are being investigated by territorial marshals. It seems our message got through. Catherine felt a deep satisfaction at the news. The confrontation in Millbrook had been about more than just her own freedom or even the fate of one small town. It had been about establishing the principle that all people, regardless of their circumstances, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. What's next? She asked. There's always more work to be done, Thomas Crow Feather said quietly. Other injustices, other people who need help. The question is whether you're ready for it. Catherine looked around at the faces of her friends and allies, people who had risked their lives to give her a chance at freedom and had stayed to help her build something meaningful from that chance. Then she looked at Ryan, who was watching her with the quiet pride of someone who had seen her transform from victim to hero. "I'm ready," she said simply. The work that followed took them across the territory and beyond, helping women and families who found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Catherine's story became a powerful tool for change, proof that transformation was possible even in the darkest situations. She learned to be comfortable with danger, to plan operations and lead teams, to speak publicly about injustice and inspire others to action. But she never forgot the lessons she had learned in that small cabin in the valley, the understanding that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to stand up for what was right. The organization grew around them, attracting people who shared their vision of a world where everyone had the opportunity to determine their own fate. They operated in the shadows when necessary, in the open when possible, always guided by the principle that every human life had value that could not be measured in dollars or determined by social status. Ryan remained her closest partner in this work, their relationship deepening from mutual respect into something richer and more complex. They were equals in every sense, each bringing their own strengths to their shared mission. The quiet man who had paid $50 for her freedom had become the person she trusted most in the world. And she knew that trust was reciprocated. One evening, as they sat by the fire in their ranch house after a particularly successful operation, Ryan asked her the question that had been unspoken between them for months. "Do you ever regret it?" he said. "The life you chose, the risks you take, the enemies you've made?" Catherine considered the question seriously, as she always did when Ryan asked her something important. She thought about the woman she had been, standing on those courthouse steps with her hands bound and her future uncertain. She thought about the woman she had become, someone who could look at herself in the mirror with pride and satisfaction. "Never," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." Ryan smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Good," he said, "because I have news from James. There's a situation developing in Colorado Territory. A mining company that's been forcing women into indentured servitude to pay their families' debts. The territorial authorities are either corrupt or intimidated, and the women have no one to turn to." Catherine felt the familiar stirring of purpose, the call to action that had become as much a part of her as breathing. "When do we leave?" "Next week, if you're willing. It'll be dangerous work, probably the most dangerous we've attempted. These mining interests have resources and connections that make Eric Evans look like a small-town bully." "All the more reason to stop them," Catherine said firmly. "How many women are we talking about?" "At least 30 that we know of. Probably more." Catherine thought of 30 women living in conditions she could barely imagine, trapped by a system that treated them as less than human. The old Catherine might have been overwhelmed by the scope of the problem, might have felt helpless in the face of such organized cruelty. The new Catherine saw only work that needed to be done. "We'll need a bigger team," she said, already beginning to plan. "More resources, better intelligence, and we'll need to be prepared for a fight." "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Ryan asked. "It's one thing to face down a desperate man like Evans. It's another to take on an entire industry that profits from human misery." Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful valley where she had learned to be strong. In the distance, she could see the lights of other ranches, other families who lived free because people like her had been willing to fight for that freedom. "I'm ready," she said, turning back to Ryan with a smile that held no trace of the frightened woman she had once been. "After all, I know exactly what I'm worth now, and it's more than any price they could ever put on me." The next morning brought a letter from Sarah Chen, who was working with a group in Denver to establish safe houses for women escaping dangerous situations. Her words were filled with hope and determination, proof that the changes they had begun in Millbrook were spreading far beyond that small town. "We're making a difference," Catherine said, sharing the letter with Ryan over breakfast. "You're making a difference," Ryan corrected. "You've become the person you were always meant to be." Catherine smiled, remembering the day she had first heard those words. They had seemed impossible then, the fantasy of a desperate woman who had no real choices. Now they were simply the truth, as solid and reliable as the sunrise. After breakfast, she walked out to the small cemetery where they had buried Eric Evans and the two hired guns who had died in the final confrontation. She had insisted on proper burials for all of them, despite the protests of some who felt they deserved less consideration. Everyone deserves dignity in death, she had said then, and she still believed it now. Standing beside Evans' grave, she felt no hatred or satisfaction, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. He could have been a leader who helped his community find legitimate solutions to their problems. Instead, he had chosen to build his power on the suffering of others, and that choice had ultimately destroyed him. "You were wrong about me," she said quietly to the weathered wooden cross that marked his resting place. "I was worth more than $50. I was worth more than any price you could have imagined, and so was every other woman you tried to sell." The wind carried her words away across the valley, toward the mountains where new challenges waited. Catherine turned her back on the past and walked toward the house where Ryan was preparing for their next mission, their next opportunity to prove that every human life had value that could not be bought or sold. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that worth was not something determined by others, but something that came from within. It was measured not in dollars or social status, but in the courage to stand up for what was right, the strength to help others find their own freedom, and the wisdom to know that true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming the world into a place where such enemies were no longer necessary. Checkpoint 14. The Colorado Territory mission proved to be everything Ryan had warned and more. The mining company's operation was vast and well protected, with guards who shot first and asked questions later. But Catherine and her team were no longer the small group of idealists who had confronted Eric Evans in Millbrook's town square. They had grown into a sophisticated organization with resources, training, and most importantly, the absolute conviction that their cause was just. The rescue operation took 3 months of careful planning and preparation. They infiltrated the mining camps, documented the conditions, gathered evidence of the illegal practices, and slowly built a network of allies among the workers who had grown disgusted with what they were being asked to enforce. When they finally struck, it was with the precision of a military operation and the moral authority of people who knew they were fighting for something larger than themselves. 37 women were freed from conditions that amounted to slavery, and the evidence they gathered led to congressional hearings that changed labor laws throughout the Western Territories. But for Catherine, the most meaningful moment came when she helped a young woman named Maria Santos step off the train in Denver. Free for the first time in 3 years, the girl's eyes held the same mixture of fear and hope that Catherine remembered from her own face in the mirror after leaving Millbrook. "What do I do now?" Maria asked, clutching Catherine's hand with desperate intensity. "I don't know how to be free." "You learn," Catherine said gently, remembering Ryan's patient teaching and her own gradual transformation. "One day at a time, one choice at a time. And you remember that you're worth more than anyone ever told you." The work continued, taking them from mining camps to lumber towns to cattle ranches, where women and children were trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. Each operation was different, each challenge unique. But the core mission remained the same, proving that every human being deserved the chance to determine their own fate. Years passed, and Catherine's reputation grew. She became known throughout the territories as someone who could not be bought, intimidated, or discouraged. Men who profited from human misery learned to fear her name, while women trapped in impossible situations began to hope that help might be coming. The organization evolved around her, attracting lawyers and doctors, teachers and journalists, all united by the belief that society could be better than it was. They established schools and clinics, safe houses and legal aid societies, building the infrastructure of a more just world one brick at a time. But Catherine never forgot where she had come from or the lessons she had learned in that small valley ranch. She returned there regularly, using it as a base of operations and a place of refuge when the work became too overwhelming. The house had grown over the years, expanded to accommodate the stream of visitors and refugees who passed through its doors. On a warm spring evening, 5 years after the confrontation in Millbrook, Catherine sat on the porch with Ryan, watching their latest group of rescued women learn to ride horses under Thomas Crow Feather's patient instruction. The sight filled her with satisfaction and something deeper, the knowledge that she had found her true calling. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" she asked Ryan. "About choices and freedom and the right to determine your own path?" "I remember," Ryan said, his hair now touched with gray but his eyes as steady as ever. "I didn't believe you then. I thought you were just being kind, telling me what I needed to hear to get through the night." "And now?" Catherine smiled, watching as one of the women successfully completed her first solo ride around the corral, her face bright with triumph and joy. "Now I know you were telling me the truth, not just about me, but about everyone. We all have the capacity to become more than our circumstances, to rise above what others expect of us." "Even Eric Evans?" Ryan asked quietly. Catherine considered the question, as she had many times over the years. Even Eric Evans. He made his choices, and they led to his destruction. But he could have chosen differently. That's the tragedy of it all. The waste of human potential when people choose fear and hatred over hope and compassion. As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared on the trail leading to the ranch. Catherine recognized him immediately, James Mitchell, his usual cheerful demeanor, replaced by an expression of grim purpose. "Trouble?" Catherine asked as he dismounted and joined them on the porch. "The worst kind," James replied, accepting the cup of coffee Ryan offered him. "There's a situation developing in New Mexico territory. A group of wealthy landowners has been importing women from Mexico under false pretenses, essentially creating a slave market for domestic servants and worse." Catherine felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest. 5 years of this work had not dulled her outrage at human cruelty. If anything, it had sharpened her determination to fight it wherever it appeared. "How many women?" she asked. "We estimate over 100, scattered across a dozen different ranches. The operation is sophisticated and well-funded, with connections to officials in both territories. They've been operating for years without interference. What kind of resistance can we expect?" "Significant. These aren't desperate small-town bullies like Evans. These are wealthy, powerful men with private armies and political connections. They won't hesitate to use violence to protect their interests." Catherine stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the valley that had become her sanctuary and stronghold. 5 years ago, she would have been terrified by the scope of such an operation. Now she saw only another challenge to be met, another group of women who needed her help. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Catherine," Ryan said carefully, "this isn't like the other operations. The risks are exponentially higher, and the chances of success are much lower. We could lose everything we've built, including our lives." "And if we do nothing?" Catherine asked, turning to face him. "How many more women will suffer? How many more lives will be destroyed while we play it safe?" Ryan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the fading light. Then he smiled, the expression holding all the love and pride that had grown between them over the years. "When do we leave?" he asked. The New Mexico operation took 8 months to plan and execute. It required resources and coordination on a scale they had never attempted before, involving dozens of operatives and allies across multiple territories. Catherine found herself at the center of it all. The woman who had once been sold for $50 now commanding an organization worth hundreds of thousands in resources and influence. The final assault came at dawn on a crisp October morning, simultaneous raids on 12 different locations coordinated with military precision. Catherine led the team that struck the main compound, where they found evidence of horrors that made even her experienced team sick with rage. But they also found something else. Women who had not given up hope, who had maintained their dignity and humanity despite everything that had been done to them. Women who looked at Catherine with recognition, understanding that she had once stood where they stood now and had found a way to rise above it. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The evidence they gathered led to arrests and prosecutions that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Laws were changed, international agreements were signed, and the pipeline of human misery was finally shut down. But for Catherine, the most meaningful moment came when she helped the last of the rescued women board a train that would take her home to her family in Mexico. The woman pressed a small wooden cross into Catherine's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Gracias, hermana," she whispered. Thank you for reminding me that I am worth more than they said. Catherine closed her fingers around the cross, feeling the weight of all the lives she had touched and all the lives yet to be saved. She thought of the frightened woman who had stood on those courthouse steps so many years ago and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. "We're all worth more than they say," she replied in Spanish, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned this truth through blood and struggle and the patient support of people who believed in her potential. The train pulled away, carrying its precious cargo toward freedom and new possibilities. Catherine watched until it disappeared around a bend, then turned to find Ryan waiting for her with the horses that would take them home to their valley. "Ready?" he asked. "Always," Catherine replied, swinging up into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had learned to be comfortable with action and danger. After all, there's always more work to be done. As they rode toward the sunset, Catherine reflected on the path that had brought her from despair to purpose, from victim to victor. She had learned that worth was not something that could be auctioned off or bought with money. It was something that came from within, something that grew stronger with each choice to help rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to hope rather than despair. The woman who had once been worth $50 had become priceless, not because of what others were willing to pay for her, but because of what she was willing to give of herself. And in that giving, she had found not just her own freedom, but the key to freeing others as well. Checkpoint 15. The years that followed brought new challenges and new victories, but also a deepening understanding of what they had accomplished and what still needed to be done. Catherine's organization had grown into something resembling a small government, with operatives in every territory and connections that reached from the halls of Congress to the most remote frontier settlements. But success brought its own burdens. The more effective they became, the more dangerous their enemies grew. Wealthy interests that profited from human misery began to organize against them, hiring assassins and corrupt officials to eliminate what they saw as a threat to the natural order. Catherine had survived 3 assassination attempts by her 40th birthday, each one more sophisticated than the last. She bore the scars of these encounters with pride, seeing them as proof that her work was making a difference. People only tried to kill you when you were succeeding in changing things they wanted to keep the same. On a cold December evening, as snow began to fall over the valley that had been her home for 15 years, Catherine received a letter that would change everything once again. It came from Washington, D.C., bearing the seal of the President of the United States. "The President wants to meet with me," she told Ryan, hardly believing the words as she spoke them. "About what?" Ryan asked, looking up from the financial reports he had been reviewing. "He's proposing a new federal agency, something called the Bureau of Human Rights. He wants me to head it up." The letter detailed a vision that took Catherine's breath away. A government agency dedicated to investigating and prosecuting violations of human dignity, with the authority to operate across state lines and the resources to take on even the most powerful interests. It was everything she had dreamed of and more, but it was also everything she had learned to distrust. Government agencies were subject to political pressures, budget constraints, and the whims of politicians who might not share her commitment to justice. The independence that had made her organization effective could be lost in the bureaucratic machinery of federal government. "What are you thinking?" Ryan asked, recognizing the conflict in her expression. "I'm thinking about a frightened woman standing on courthouse steps, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder," Catherine said slowly. "I'm thinking about all the women we've helped over the years, and all the ones we couldn't reach in time. I'm thinking about whether this is an opportunity to help more people or a trap that will destroy everything we've built." They talked long into the night, weighing the possibilities and dangers. The offer represented recognition at the highest levels of government, validation that their work was not only necessary, but vital to the nation's moral progress. It also represented the chance to help people on a scale they had never imagined possible. But it also meant giving up the flexibility and independence that had made them effective, trading the ability to act quickly and decisively for the legitimacy and resources of official sanction. It meant becoming part of the system they had spent years fighting against, hoping to change it from within rather than challenging it from without. In the end, the decision came down to a simple question. Where could she do the most good? Catherine's response to the president was characteristically direct. She would accept the position, but only under certain conditions. The Bureau would have complete independence in its investigations, with no political interference from any source. It would have sufficient funding to operate effectively, with the authority to hire and train its own agents. And it would have the power to prosecute cases in federal court, bypassing local authorities who might be corrupt or compromised. To her surprise, the president agreed to all her conditions. The political climate was changing, she learned, driven partly by the publicity her organization had generated over the years. The American people were beginning to understand that human rights were not just a moral issue, but a practical one, that societies built on oppression and exploitation were ultimately unstable and unsustainable. The Bureau of Human Rights opened its doors in the spring of 1889, with Catherine Moore as its first director. Her staff was drawn largely from her old organization, people who had proven their commitment through years of dangerous work in the field. They brought with them not just skills and experience, but an understanding of what they were fighting for that could not be taught in any government training program. The Bureau's first major case involved a network of labor contractors who had been enslaving immigrant workers across the industrial Northeast. The investigation took 2 years and required coordination with dozens of local and state agencies. But when it was complete, over 300 people had been freed, and the contractors were facing federal charges. But for Catherine, the most satisfying moment came when she personally escorted a young Irish woman named Bridget O'Malley to the train that would take her home to her family in Boston. The girl's story was heartbreakingly familiar, promises of good work and fair wages that had led to captivity and abuse. "How did you know?" Bridget asked as they waited for the train. "How did you know we were there?" "Because I've been where you are," Catherine said simply. "I know what it feels like to be treated as property instead of a person, and I know that no one deserves that, no matter what their circumstances." Bridget looked at her with something approaching awe. "You were a slave too?" "In a different way, but yes. I was sold at auction to pay a town's debts. A good man bought me and gave me the chance to choose my own path. Everything I've done since then has been about making sure other people get that same chance." The train arrived, and Catherine helped Bridget board with the other rescued workers. As it pulled away from the station, she felt the familiar satisfaction of work well done, but also something new, the knowledge that she was no longer operating on the margins of society, but at its very center, with the full power of the federal government behind her efforts. Over the next decade, the Bureau of Human Rights became one of the most respected and feared agencies in Washington. Its investigations reached into every corner of American society, from the boardrooms of major corporations to the back rooms of small-town politics. No one was too powerful to investigate, no crime too small to matter if it involved the systematic oppression of human beings. Catherine's reputation grew with the Bureau's success. She was invited to speak at universities and churches, to testify before Congress and advise foreign governments. But she never forgot where she had come from or the lessons she had learned in that small valley ranch. Every year on the anniversary of her auction in Millbrook, she would return to the valley for a week of quiet reflection. She would walk the familiar trails, tend the small garden behind the ranch house, and remember the woman she had been and the journey that had brought her to where she was. On her 50th birthday, as she sat on the porch where she had spent so many evenings planning operations and dreaming of a better world, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Chen, now a successful lawyer and activist in her own right, had come to pay her respects to the woman who had saved her life. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Ryan hadn't bid on you that day?" Sarah asked as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Catherine considered the question, as she had many times over the years. "I think someone else would have done what needed to be done," she said finally. "Maybe not in the same way, maybe not as effectively, but the need was there. The injustice was there. Someone would have stood up against it eventually." "But it was you," Sarah pointed out. "You were the one who chose to fight back, who chose to help others instead of just escaping to safety. That matters." Catherine smiled, thinking of all the women they had helped over the years, all the lives that had been changed and the systems that had been challenged. "We all make choices," she said. "The important thing is to make them count." As the years passed and Catherine entered her 60s, she began to think about legacy and succession. The Bureau of Human Rights had become an institution, its work continuing even when she was not directly involved. But she wanted to make sure that the spirit that had driven its creation would survive her own inevitable retirement. She established a training academy for human rights investigators, drawing on everything she had learned over decades of fieldwork. She wrote memoirs that became required reading for anyone serious about fighting injustice. Most importantly, she mentored a new generation of leaders who would carry the work forward into the 20th century. But perhaps her most important legacy was the simple example she had set, that worth was not something determined by others, but something that came from within, something that grew stronger when it was used in service of others. The woman who had once been auctioned off for $50 had become priceless. Not through accumulation of wealth or power, but through the consistent choice to value human dignity above personal comfort. On a warm summer evening in 1905, Catherine Moore sat on the porch of the ranch house where she had learned to be strong, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had become her chosen family. At 71, she was still sharp and determined, still ready to take on any challenge that threatened human dignity. A young woman approached the porch, one of the newest recruits to the Bureau's training program. She was nervous, clearly intimidated by the legend she was meeting, but determined to ask the question that had brought her here. "Director Moore," she began hesitantly, "I've read your memoirs, studied your cases, learned about everything you've accomplished. But I still don't understand how you did it, how you went from being a victim to being this." Catherine looked at the young woman, seeing in her face the same mixture of fear and determination that she remembered from her own reflection so many years ago. The question was one she had been asked countless times, and her answer had evolved over the decades as her understanding deepened. "I learned that I was worth more than $50, she said simply, "more than any price anyone could put on me. And once I learned that about myself, I had to help other people learn it about themselves. That's all any of us can do, really. Recognize our own worth and then help others recognize theirs." The young woman nodded, but Catherine could see that she was still struggling with the concept. It was not an easy lesson to learn, especially for someone who had grown up in a world that constantly told women their value was determined by others. "It takes time," Catherine added gently, "and it takes practice. Every day, you have to choose to believe in your own worth, even when the world tells you otherwise. Every day, you have to choose to act on that belief, to stand up for yourself and others. It's not easy, but it's the most important thing you'll ever do." As the evening wore on and the guests gradually departed, Catherine found herself alone with Ryan on the porch, where their partnership had deepened into something richer and more enduring than either had expected. At 73, he was still her closest advisor and dearest friend, the person who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he had posed so many years earlier. Catherine looked out over the valley that had been her sanctuary and stronghold, thinking of all the battles fought and won, all the lives saved and changed, all the progress made toward a more just world. She thought of the frightened woman who had stood on courthouse steps with bound hands in an uncertain future, and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. "None," she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had lived fully and purposefully. "I became exactly who I was meant to be, and I helped others do the same. What more could anyone ask for?" The stars came out one by one over the peaceful valley, the same stars that had witnessed her transformation from victim to victor, from property to person, from someone who was worth $50 to someone who was priceless. And in their ancient light, Catherine Moore smiled, knowing that her story would continue in the lives of all the people she had touched, all the systems she had changed, and all the young women who would learn, as she had learned, that they were worth more than any price the world might try to place on them.